Father Hans Schmidt. In the first days of September 1913, pieces of a young woman's body began washing up along the New Jersey shoreline, wrapped in paper and a pillowcase embroidered with a single letter. The letter was an A. That one stitched initial would lead detectives across the Hudson River into a Manhattan rectory and straight to a man no one suspected, an ordained Catholic priest. To this day, he remains the only priest ever put to death for taking a life on American soil. Hans Schmidt was born in Bavaria in early January of 1881 and ordained in Germany before emigrating to the United States in 1909. He served first in Louisville, Kentucky, then moved east to New York, where he was assigned to St. Boniface and later to St. Joseph's Parish in Manhattan. It was at St. Boniface that he met Anna Allmuller, a young housekeeper and seamstress who had come to America from Austria-Hungary and worked at the rectory. The two began a relationship that was strictly forbidden for a priest. Schmidt went so far as to perform a private marriage ceremony himself in February of 1913, though he had no authority to do any such thing. Then Anna became pregnant. On the night of September 2nd, 1913, in an uptown apartment he had quietly rented under a false name, Schmidt ended Anna's life. Over the hours that followed, he disposed of her remains in the Hudson River, expecting the current to carry away every trace of what he had done. It very nearly worked. But on the 5th and 6th of September, the wrapped remains surfaced near Weehawken, on the New Jersey side of the water. Detectives recovered them piece by piece, and among the materials was that monogrammed pillowcase. Rather than a dead end, it became a thread to pull. Inspector Joseph Faureau traced the pillowcase to a particular shop and the lease on the apartment to the man who had signed for it. Following Anna's own connections, investigators reached a cousin named Joseph Eagler, who pointed them toward a priest at St. Joseph's Rectory. Faureau was already a respected name in American policing, an early champion of fingerprint evidence, and he and his detectives closed the distance with unusual speed. On the night of September 13th, 1913, they confronted Schmidt, and he confessed almost immediately. His explanations shifted and grew stranger by the hour. At one point, he said he had loved her. At another, he insisted that a saint had appeared to him and demanded a sacrifice. While searching his properties, detectives uncovered something they had not expected at all. Schmidt kept a second apartment, which he had been running as a counterfeiting operation alongside a dentist he knew, a man named Ernest Murray. Inside, they found printing plates and the makings of a scheme to pass forged banknotes. A priest, a forger, and a man who had just confessed to taking a life. All of them were the same person. His defense was that he was insane. The first trial, in December of 1913, ended with a jury unable to agree, reportedly leaning 10-2 toward guilt. A second trial opened in January of 1914, and this time the jury deliberated for only about 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree homicide. Under the law of that era, the sentence was automatic and absolute. It was death. Appeals delayed the execution by roughly a year. During that stretch, Schmidt admitted he had faked his insanity entirely, then tried to shift the blame, claiming Anna had died during a botched procedure performed by someone else. The courts rejected the story outright. On February 18, 1916, Hans Schmidt was put to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison and buried in the prison cemetery. He was suspected in other deaths, including that of a young girl back in Louisville, though he was never charged in connection with any of them. As of today, more than a century later, his case still stands alone. He remains the only Catholic priest ever executed for a crime of this kind in the United States. Schmidt's crime surfaced within days because a river refused to keep it secret. The next man would hide behind something far harder to search. A confessional, an institution with every reason to protect its own, and 57 years of silence. Father John Feit. On the Saturday before Easter in 1960, a beloved schoolteacher in McAllen, Texas, left her home to go to confession. She never came back. 5 days later, her body was pulled from a canal, and the young priest who heard her final confession would not face a jury for what happened to her for another 57 years. Irene Garza was 25 years old, an elementary school teacher adored by her students and her community. She had been crowned a local beauty queen, named Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, and she was the kind of person whose absence was noticed the moment it happened. John Feit was 27, a Catholic priest ordained in 1958, completing his pastoral training at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen. On Holy Saturday, April 16, 1960, Irene went to the church for confession. Instead of the confessional booth, Feit later admitted that he had heard her confession privately, inside the rectory. That was the last anyone saw of her alive. Her body was recovered from a nearby canal on April 21st. An autopsy concluded that she had been assaulted and had died of suffocation. Suspicion fell on Feit almost from the start. He admitted to the unusual private confession. A photographic slide viewer belonging to him was found near the scene once the canal was drained. He had visible scratches on his hands, and only weeks earlier, he had been linked to an assault on another young woman at a nearby church, an incident to which he pleaded no contest, paying a fine of $500. 2 violent encounters with young women, weeks apart, both connected to the same young priest. And yet the case went cold. Allegations would later surface that local officials and the church itself had quietly shielded him, even arranging for him to spend time at a monastery, rather than face the questions piling up around him. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Feit left the priesthood in 1972, married, raised a family in Arizona, and built a quiet life far from Texas. For decades, it looked as though no one would ever answer for Irene Garza. The case was reopened in 2002 by the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit and revived again in 2015 under a newly elected district attorney who had campaigned, in part, on a promise to finally bring it to trial. If it had stayed buried just a little longer, this would be a very different story. In February of 2016, Feit was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona, and extradited back to Texas. At trial in Edinburgh, 2 men who had known him decades earlier testified that Feit had confessed to them. One was a former monk named Dale Tashiny, who said Feit had described the act to him years before while seeking guidance. The other was a former priest, Joseph O'Brien, who recalled Feit admitting to taking Irene's life. Their accounts, carried across more than half a century, became the spine of the prosecution's case. On December 7, 2017, after 57 years, John Feit, by then 85 years old, was found guilty. The very next day, he was sentenced to life in prison. Feit's lawyers filed an appeal, but it would never be decided. On the morning of February 11, 2020, he was found unresponsive in his cell at the Estelle unit. He was pronounced dead at a Huntsville hospital a short time later, with cardiac arrest listed as the preliminary cause. Because he died with his appeal still pending, that appeal was set aside, and his conviction was left to stand. As of today, the case is closed. Irene Garza's family had waited nearly 6 decades for that verdict, and in the end, they outlived the man who took her from them. Feit's case turned on a Holy Saturday and a confession that was never meant to be overheard. 20 years later, in a hospital chapel in Ohio, another Holy Saturday would end with another religious figure dead and another priest standing over an altar cloth. Father Gerald Robinson, an elderly nun who had given more than 50 years of her life to the church, was found dead in the sacristy of a hospital chapel in Toledo, Ohio, on Holy Saturday, 1980. Her body had been covered with an altar cloth, and several of the wounds over her heart had been arranged in the shape of an inverted cross. The man who would eventually stand trial for it was the chapel's own chaplain, and it would take 26 years to finally bring him there. Sister Margaret Ann Paul was 71 years old, a sister of Mercy and the sacristan who tended the chapel at Mercy Hospital. Gerald Robinson was a Catholic priest who served there as a chaplain. To the people around them, they were simply 2 familiar figures of the church, moving through the quiet routines of hospital ministry. On Holy Saturday, April 5, 1980, Sister Margaret Ann was fatally harmed in the sacristy, her body bearing more than 30 wounds, several of them positioned with deliberate care over her heart. The investigators who first saw the scene believed they might be looking at a ritual crime, the altar cloth laid over her like a final, mocking gesture. Robinson was questioned that same year, but he was never charged. According to the detectives who worked it, one early interview was cut short when a senior police official allowed a Monsignor to escort the priest away, and the momentum simply died. The case went cold for more than 2 decades. Then, in 2003, a woman who came to be known only as Survivor Doe wrote to church leaders alleging that Robinson had abused her years earlier in ritual settings. Her account reached the cold case unit of the Lucas County Prosecutor's Office, and investigators connected it back to the unsolved death of Sister Margaret Ann. Robinson was arrested in April of 2004. What followed was almost without precedent in American courts, the trial of a Catholic priest for taking the life of a nun. At trial in 2006, the centerpiece of the case was a sword-shaped letter opener that had been found in Robinson's living quarters back in 1980. A prosecutor told the jury that the blade fit the nun's wounds the way a key fits a lock, and that its tip matched a small opening found in her remains. A bloodstain expert named Paulette Sutton testified that a faint mark on the altar cloth appeared to carry the outline of the United States Capitol building, matching a small medallion set into the opener itself. To confirm the fit of the blade, the nun's remains had been exhumed, and prosecutors said the tip slid into a small opening in her jaw. Even the renowned forensic scientist, Dr. Henry Lee, took the stand, testifying that one stain shared similar characteristics with the medallion, while noting inconsistencies in others. But the forensic picture was not clean, and this is the part that still does not entirely make sense. The state's own expert would only say the opener could not be ruled out, never that it was a definitive match. And DNA recovered from beneath the victim's fingernails belonged to an unidentified man. It did not belong to Robinson. On May 11, 2006, Gerald Robinson was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years to life. He appealed. An Ohio appeals court upheld the conviction. In 2008, the state Supreme Court declined to take the case, and a later bid for post-conviction relief was denied. Robinson died in prison hospice in Columbus on July 4, 2014, at the age of 76. He maintained, all the way to the end, that he was innocent. As of today, his conviction remains on the books. It also remains contested, the unmatched DNA beneath Sister Margaret Ann's fingernails never explained. Robinson's case left a question hanging in the air, a single piece of evidence that pointed somewhere the verdict did not. Halfway around the world, in a convent in southern India, another religious death would be ruled a simple accident, and stay that way for almost 30 years before anyone admitted what had really happened. Father Thomas Couture. Sometime before dawn on a March morning in 1992, a young nun in the southern Indian state of Kerala went down to the convent kitchen for a drink of water. She never returned to her room. By morning, she was found in the convent well, and for years the official story was that she had simply fallen. It would take 28 years, 3 accused members of the clergy, and a national outcry to establish what truly happened to Sister Abhaya. Sister Abhaya, born Beena Thomas, was a young nun and student living at St. Pius X Convent in Kottayam. Father Thomas Couture was a senior diocesan official. Sister Sephi was a nun at the same convent. All of them belonged to the close-knit Knanaya Catholic community. On the morning of March 27, 1992, Sister Abhaya's body was discovered in the well on the convent grounds. Local police and the state crime branch moved quickly to treat it as a drowning, most likely a suicide. For the people who had actually known her, that explanation never once fit. An activist named Jomon Puthenpurakal formed an action council to press for a proper inquiry. Dozens of nuns, along with the Mother Superior, petitioned for the death to be examined as a homicide. The case was handed to the Central Bureau of Investigation in 1993, but over the years that followed, the agency filed closure report after closure report. One in 1996, another in 1999, and a third in 2005. The theory the investigators eventually built came down to this. In the early hours of that morning, Sister Abhaya came down to the kitchen for water and walked in on the accused in a compromising situation. To keep her from speaking, she was struck and then placed in the well, the scene arranged to resemble a suicide. Key testimony came from a local thief who said he had seen Couture on the convent grounds that night, and from an activist who told the court of a confession that had been relayed to him. Prosecutors also pointed to a medical procedure Sister Sephi had undergone shortly before her arrest, which they argued was meant to conceal the truth. Piece by piece, the case drew the attention of the entire country to just how long and how thoroughly the truth had been buried. The three accused were arrested in November of 2008 and charged the following year. One of them, a former Malayalam professor named Jose Putrikayo, was discharged in 2018 for lack of evidence. The remaining two would carry the case to its verdict. On December 22, 2020, after a judgment that ran to hundreds of pages, a special court in Thiruvananthapuram found Father Thomas Couture and Sister Sephi guilty of taking Sister Abhaya's life and of destroying evidence. The day after, both were sentenced to life imprisonment. And no, that is not where the story ends. In June of 2022, the Kerala High Court suspended both life sentences and granted the two of them bail while their appeals were heard. The court noted that, on an initial reading of the evidence raised by the defense, it could not justify keeping them imprisoned while the appeal stayed undecided. The two were ordered to post bail and barred from leaving the state of Kerala. As of the most recent reporting, that appeal is still pending. Both convicted members of the clergy remain free on bail, their sentences suspended, and no final ruling has come down. After 28 years just to reach a verdict, the case of Sister Abhaya is, in the eyes of the law, still not entirely closed. Abhaya's death was disguised as an accident, dressed up to look like something it was not. The last of these five involves a different kind of disguise altogether. A quiet, small-town priest, a double loss of life that baffled investigators for nearly 2 years, and a confession that surfaced only after it was far too late to charge anyone with anything. Father Ryan Erickson. Just after 1 o'clock on a winter afternoon in 2002, a man walked into a funeral home in Hudson, Wisconsin, and within minutes, 2 people were dead. Nothing was taken. There were no witnesses. For almost 2 years, the case sat unsolved, despite a $100,000 reward and roughly 1,800 interviews. The answer, when it finally came, pointed to the last person the town would have guessed: a local Catholic priest. Daniel O'Connell was 39 years old, the manager of the O'Connell Funeral Home and a well-known, civically active member of his community. James Ellison was 22, an intern studying mortuary science. Ryan Erickson was a Catholic priest ordained in 2000, serving as an associate pastor at parishes in the Hudson area. On February 5, 2002, in the span of just over 10 minutes early in the afternoon, a gunman entered the funeral home and fatally harmed Daniel O'Connell at his desk. James Ellison, who came upon the scene, was harmed as well. Both died of gunshot wounds from a 9mm pistol. Robbery was ruled out almost immediately. Nothing at all had been taken. The 2 deaths went unsolved for nearly 2 years. Investigators eventually focused on Erickson for several reasons. He knew details about the crime scene that had never been made public, including the number of shots that were fired and the nature of the wounds. He owned a number of firearms, and, according to investigators, Daniel O'Connell had reportedly intended to confront Erickson over an allegation of abuse. That allegation involved the mistreatment of a child, and it sits in this story only as the motive investigators believed drove the crime. It was the suspicion that a position of trust had been betrayed, and that the funeral home manager had come to learn of it, that gave investigators the connection they had been missing for so long. The substance of that allegation was never the subject of a trial, because there would never be one. After police questioned him in December of 2004, Ryan Erickson took his own life on December 19, 2004. He left behind notes denying any involvement in the deaths. With his passing, no charges could be filed. and the criminal case, in the ordinary sense, was over before it ever began. Because Eriksson could not be tried, the victims' families pushed for something rare: a John Doe judicial inquiry, a court proceeding designed to examine the evidence and reach a finding even without a living defendant. In October of 2005, after hearing that evidence, a St. Croix County judge named Eric Lundell ruled that Ryan Eriksson had probably committed the crimes and placed the strength of the evidence at the very top of the scale, a 10 out of 10. A deacon named Russell Lundgren testified that Eriksson had come to him and admitted that he had done it and that he was terrified of being caught, even asking aloud what happened to young men and to priests who were sent to prison. The judge also found it likely that Eriksson had committed the abuse at the center of the alleged motive. The bishop of the Diocese of Superior, Raphael Fliss, issued a public apology. Ryan Eriksson was never charged and never convicted, for the simple reason that he died before either could happen. But a court did examine the case, and it named him, on the record, as the person who most probably took the lives of Daniel O'Connell and James Ellison. As of today, that judicial finding stands as the closest thing to a verdict this case will ever produce. For the families, it was the closest thing to an answer they were ever going to get. Eriksson's story closed not with a trial, but with a judge's quiet certainty and a town left to make sense of it. And these 5 men are only the beginning. The figures still ahead hid their crimes behind insurance policies, fake deaths, staged fires, and stolen inheritances. Every one of them trusting that the collar they wore would keep anyone from looking too closely. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Reverend John David Terry. In June of 1987, firefighters in Nashville, Tennessee pulled a body from a burning church and assumed the worst, that the pastor himself had died in the flames. The congregation grieved. The newspapers ran the story. But when the medical examiner looked closer, the remains did not belong to the pastor at all. He was very much alive, and he had arranged the entire thing. John David Terry led the Emmanuel Church of Christ, a oneness Pentecostal congregation on Woodland Street in Nashville, and he carried the lofty title of Associate Bishop Overseer. Behind the pulpit, though, he had been quietly helping himself to church funds for years, going back to about 1984. In March of 1987, he was passed over for the role of Bishop Overseer, the promotion he believed was rightfully his, and something in him hardened into a plan. The plan was to vanish, to fake his own death, and to walk away from his debts and his deceptions as a brand new man. A plan like that needed a body, and Terry chose a man who trusted him without question. James Matheny was 32 years old, a down-on-his-luck handyman of similar height and build, whom Terry had employed, housed, and befriended. On June 15, 1987, Terry lured him to the church under the pretense of a fishing trip, and there he ended Matheny's life. Then he went to disturbing lengths to keep the body from being identified, removing the features that could reveal whose it truly was, and disposing of them in a lake near Dover, Tennessee. He planted his own credit cards on what remained, cards that carried Matheny's fingerprints, scattered a blood-smeared towel and other false clues, and set the church on fire so the body inside would be taken for his own. The world was supposed to bury John David Terry. John David Terry was supposed to start over. It fell apart almost at once. Firefighters reached the blaze and put it out before the body was destroyed, and the medical examiner quickly established that the remains were not Terry's. Homicide detectives, among them an investigator named Robert Moore, were already uneasy. There had been no forced entry, and valuables sat untouched, which made the scene look less like a tragedy and more like a piece of theater. Then came the development Terry had never accounted for. Watching the news, he saw that he was not being mourned as a victim. He was being hunted as a wanted man. Within about 2 days of taking Matheny's life, he contacted an attorney named Seth Norman and turned himself in. Terry was tried for capital homicide and arson. In 1988, he was convicted, and after confessing in open court, he was sentenced to death on September 26th. 1988. The Tennessee Supreme Court later set that death sentence aside, ruling that the jury had been given improper instructions and ordered a new sentencing hearing. A second jury heard the case and arrived at exactly the same conclusion the first one had: death. And no, that is not a misreading of the record. Two separate juries looked at what Terry had done and reached for the most severe punishment the state allowed. Terry settled onto death row, where he remained through years of appeals. In 2003, shortly before his case was due back before an appeals court, he took his own life inside the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. He never faced execution by the state, and he never walked free as the new man he had imagined becoming. As of today, the case is closed, and James Matheny, the friend Terry selected precisely because that friend trusted him, is remembered as the man whose life was spent to cover a lie. Terry tried to disappear by turning a friend into a stand-in for his own death. The next man did not run anywhere at all. He stayed right inside his church, stood before his grieving congregation, and delivered a loving eulogy for two people he had called Mom and Dad. John Nelson Canning. 2 weeks after an elderly couple were laid to rest in Sebring, Florida, the pastor who delivered their eulogy stood before the mourners and spoke about how deeply the two of them had cared for others. He told the room they had perhaps cared too much. What no one sitting in those pews understood was that the man at the lectern was the same man who had ended both of their lives. John Nelson Canning had come down from Maine, where he had spent years preaching at a string of New England churches, the kind of traveling minister who could fill a room and win a crowd over quickly. Not everyone back home had trusted him, and his old congregations were later said to be divided about the man, even years after he moved on. In 1987, he founded the Fountain of Life Pentecostal Church in Sebring and started over. By the middle of the 90s, he was 58 years old and close, or so it appeared, with two of his founding members. Leo and Hazel Gleese were both 90. Leo, a retired draftsman, was living with Parkinson's disease. Hazel, a former hairstylist, was nearly blind. They were so fond of their pastor that they treated him like family. And in 1994, they handed him their power of attorney. That trust was the opening Canning had been waiting for. He began moving money out of the ailing couple's accounts and into his own, a steady drain that only grew as the Gleeses became less and less able to keep track of it. On January 2nd, 1995, the couple finally confronted him about the funds that had gone missing, and Canning answered that confrontation by taking both of their lives inside their own home. Then he did something that tells you everything about the man. He spent the rest of the day at the beach with friends. The following morning, January 3rd, he made a show of discovering their bodies and reporting the deaths, betting that the role of grieving pastor would keep suspicion far away from him. It did the exact opposite. Investigators found it strange that he had waited an entire day to report the deaths, and he became their prime suspect almost immediately. A state agent named King, along with others on the case, noticed that Canning's grief did not ring true, that there were scratches on his arms, and that a pale band on his wrist suggested a watch had recently disappeared. He refused a polygraph, and somehow it gets worse for him from there. On church property, investigators recovered the physical evidence that sealed his fate, including bloodied clothing and a walking cane that had belonged to one of the victims. And then there was the eulogy. About 2 weeks after the deaths, Canning stood in front of the mourners and praised the Gleeses as loving, generous people who had given too much of themselves to others. He was describing the very couple he had taken from the world, and he delivered the words with the calm of a man who believed he had already gotten away with it. Canning was arrested on March 3, 1995, charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide and held without bail. Facing the real possibility of a death sentence, he chose instead to plead guilty. On March 6, 1996, a Highlands County judge named David Langford sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of release. As of the most recent records, John Nelson Canning remains inside the Florida prison system, serving those 2 life sentences with no path back to freedom. The church he built in Sebring outlived its founder's reputation by a wide margin, and the elderly couple who called him family, who trusted him with their money and their lives, were gone within a single day of asking him one honest question about where their savings had gone. Canning was undone within days, because the arithmetic of his grief never quite added up. The next man would not be caught for more than a decade, and the thing that finally exposed him was his own mouth. Reverend James Chastain. A young preacher in Georgia arrived early for his shift at a dairy one June morning in 1979, and not long afterward, his co-workers noticed that his trailer was on fire. His wife was inside it. According to the people who stood and watched it burn, the preacher seemed strangely unbothered, and he made almost no attempt to save her. It would take 11 years for a court to decide what that calm really meant. James Pierre Chastain was a Methodist preacher who had served several churches across the state of Georgia. He was born in 1957, and at the time of the fire, he was working at a dairy and living in the trailer beside it with his first wife, Teresa Gale Chastain. To the people around them, they were an ordinary young couple, and the fire that took Teresa looked, at first, like nothing more than a horrible accident. Those who came to know Chastain better, though, would later describe a man who could turn cold and dangerous when he felt wronged. On June 18, 1979, the trailer went up in flames with Teresa trapped inside, and she did not survive. Witnesses would later describe a husband who knew exactly who was caught in that fire and behaved as though it barely touched him. At the time, there simply was not enough to charge anyone, and the case slid quietly into the cold files, where it sat for years. What eventually reopened it was Chastain himself. Over time, he made statements to law enforcement that pointed squarely back at him, and on January 4, 1990, he was finally indicted. When the case reached trial, prosecutors brought far more than the fire. They had a confession, one that Chastain later tried to take back. And if that confession had been the only thing against him, he might have talked his way clear. But then came the pattern. His second wife testified that in August of 1987, Chastain had tried to suffocate her with a pillow as she lay in bed, and that she had later found a handwritten note in which he laid out plans to take her life and to burn down his brother-in-law's home. Chastain himself admitted that he had set that brother-in-law's house on fire. The prosecution argued that this so-called other acts evidence revealed a method, a man who reached for fire and suffocation when his anger boiled over, and who had threatened in writing to do to a second wife exactly what investigators believed he had already done to his first. Slowly, that portrait hardened into something a jury could see clearly. The jury convicted him of malice homicide and first-degree arson, and on May 1, 1990, the sentence came down. Life in prison for taking Teresa's life, and an additional 20 consecutive years for the arson. Chastain appealed, arguing that his confession, which he had since recanted, and the damaging testimony about his other acts should never have been placed in front of the jury at all. In 1991, the Georgia Supreme Court rejected every one of those arguments and affirmed both the conviction and the sentence, leaving the verdict firmly in place. As of the most recent corrections records, James Chastain remains in the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections, still serving the sentence handed down for a fire he set more than 4 decades ago. Teresa Gale Chastain was his wife, and for 11 long years, her death was filed away as nothing more than a tragic accident in a burning trailer. Chastain's undoing was a note he never should have written, and a confession he could not unsay. The next case turns on a different kind of paper, a torn-up love letter, found on the floor beside a dying man in an office where nothing at all had been stolen. Pastor David Love. When police walked into a Missouri insurance office in the spring of 2010, they found the agent who worked there fatally shot at his desk and scattered nearby the torn pieces of a love letter. Nothing had been taken. The letter had not been written by the dead man, and it had not been written to his wife. It had been written by his own pastor, David Love became the pastor of New Hope Baptist Church in Independence, Missouri in 1999. At the age of 38, he was the son of missionaries, and he arrived carrying a history that should have raised questions in anyone paying attention. At churches in Virginia and in Independence, he had already trailed financial controversy behind him, including roughly $30,000 in missionary funds that had simply gone unaccounted for. None of it stopped him from stepping behind a new pulpit and earning a new community's trust. Randy Stone was 42, an insurance agent and a devoted member of Love's congregation. Randy managed the church's finances. He had a wife named Teresa and 2 children, and he trusted his pastor completely. What Randy did not know was that his pastor and his own wife had been involved for years, by some accounts, close to a decade. The 2 of them had hidden it in plain sight, inside the same congregation Randy faithfully served. On March 31st, 2010, Randy Stone was fatally shot inside his insurance office on Noland Road. Robbery was ruled out almost immediately because nothing of value had been touched. Beyond the torn letter, investigators recovered suspicious emails and prepaid phones, and prosecutors would later allege that Love's plan did not end with Randy. He intended to take his own wife's life as well, and to stage it as an accident, clearing the way for himself and Teresa Stone. Pay close attention to that detail, because it shows this was never a crime of sudden passion. It was a design. In the days that followed, Love did something that should sound familiar by now. He helped deliver part of Randy Stone's eulogy. Then he resigned from the church, left Missouri behind, and took a job driving a truck in South Carolina. Detectives followed the trail. They lured him to a trucking terminal under a pretext, and in November of 2010, they arrested him in South Carolina, where he reportedly broke down and made admissions to investigators. Love was first charged with first-degree homicide, which in Missouri carries a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. To step back from that fate, he pleaded guilty on November 9, 2011, to a reduced count of second-degree homicide along with armed criminal action in Jackson County Circuit Court. It was the kind of bargain that traded a guaranteed life behind bars for a sliver of a future. The arrangement still carried a life sentence, but with a chance at parole after 25.5 years, which places his first possible eligibility around the year 2036. Teresa Stone pleaded guilty to conspiracy, and on June 15, 2012, she was sentenced to 8 years. As of today, David Love remains incarcerated in Missouri, and he will not even be eligible to request parole until roughly 2036. Randy Stone trusted 2 people in this world, more than anyone else, his wife and his pastor. In the end, it was those 2, working together, who took everything he had. Love at least lived to stand in a courtroom and answer for what he had done. The final man in this account never gave anyone that chance. With detectives closing in, he made one last stop at a bookstore, and then he made certain there would never be a trial at all. Reverend James Castria. With detectives circling and a sit-down with state police already on his calendar, a New Jersey pastor spent part of one of his final afternoons inside a Christian bookstore, buying a 10-cent bookmark printed with the words of Psalm 23. This was March of 1995. He never kept that appointment with the police. Instead, he aimed his car at a concrete bridge support and drove into it at roughly 80 miles an hour. James Castria was 45 years old, the pastor of a small non-denominational gospel church in Clifton, New Jersey, with a wife and 2 children of his own. He had served at a Baptist church before that, which he left in 1992. Years earlier, he had built a close bond with Lowell and Susan Engel of Staten Island, New York, a trusting and vulnerable couple who had come to lean on him. In 1988, it had been Castria himself who officiated their wedding, binding their lives to his in the eyes of the church. The motive, as it so often is in these stories, was money. When Susan Engel inherited about $85,000, Castria arranged to become a co-signer on a joint account, and then he quietly made most of the withdrawals himself, draining somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000 out of it. He reportedly funneled the money toward buying a larger home and the Engels were led to believe they would all live there together, a promise that kept them close and kept them quiet. Around the 9th and 10th of January, 1995, Lowell, who was 68, and Susan, who was 50, disappeared from their senior housing on Staten Island. By then, the money was already mostly gone. For more than 2 months, there was no trace of them. Then, on March 23, 1995, their bodies were discovered in the woods of Coolbaugh Township in the Pennsylvania Poconos near Stroudsburg. They had been fatally harmed, and investigators concluded they had died in that area weeks before they were found. Castria had performed their wedding, and he had also delivered their eulogy, the same grim ritual that runs through so many of these cases. Detectives in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania settled on him as their prime suspect, and Castria admitted to Pennsylvania State Police that he had taken $40,000 from the couple. He was supposed to sit for questioning again on March 28, 1995. That was the day he bought the bookmark, with its quiet promise that he would fear no evil, and then drove into the bridge. A sergeant named Rick Antero reviewed the scene and ruled the death a suicide. Because Castria died before any charge could ever be filed, he was never tried and never convicted in a court of law. And the full story of what happened in those Pennsylvania woods went into the ground with him. In the end, authorities closed the case with James Castria, named as the person responsible for the deaths of Lowell and Susan Engel. As of today, that is exactly where the matter stands. 2 trusting people followed their pastor toward the promise of a shared home, and the man who had married them, and who then stood up to eulogize them, made certain he would never have to explain, under oath, what he had done. Every one of these 10 cases was real, documented in court records, news archives, and the findings of investigators who refused to let them go. The collar that was meant to signal trust became, in each of these stories, the very thing that let a crime hide in plain sight for days or for decades. The records are public now, and the names of the people who were lost have not been forgotten. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.